Illustrator John Howe spent over 10 years in New Zealand designing the sets of the films which director Peter Jackson adapted from the novels The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. After this mammoth task, John decided to share with us his passion for the author of these novels, J.R.R. Tolkien. In Oxford, where the writer studied and taught his entire life, medievalist Leo Carruthers introduced us to the lover of ancient languages and legends that was Tolkien. Itching to know more, John decided to travel across Europe to discover these legends in an attempt to understand Tolkien's sources of inspiration and simultaneously elucidate the mysteries surrounding the Hobbit people. In a unique and timeless place, charged with history and filled with artifacts, John Howe meets with Leo Carruthers, who will help him in his search.
So, after a long journey which took me as far as the Antipodes, I wanted to return to Tolkien's sources. Such a vast, elaborate, extraordinary world with so many characters and peoples, and notably these very mysterious little people known as hobbits. I figured there would definitely be far more leads here in Europe.
That's right. There are plenty of leads, plenty of sources, plenty of legends, and plenty of myths. Tolkien drew heavily on Norse legends, the legends of Northern Europe, Germanic and Celtic legends too. There isn't a single source for The Hobbit, or for The Lord of the Rings, but many.
All right, so many sources, many journeys. Where should I start then?
Once upon a time, there was Merlin the magician, the most famous wizard in the world, and it's the story of his birth I'm going to tell you now. Our story begins in the depths of hell. The devil has just awoken and he realizes everyone has disappeared. All the humans have gone. So, to find a way of getting the humans back to the depths of hell, the devil decides to convene the Great Council of Demons. The following day, the creatures known as Satan's helpers turn up and take their place at the table. And the devil asks them the following question: do you know how we can lure the humans back onto the path of eternal damnation? At the table, a tiny demon raises his hand and says, "Mr. Satan, I have an idea. Our problem is this. God sent his son to earth, and this son of his descended to the very depths of hell. Well, you, Lord Satan, Prince of Darkness, no later than tomorrow, ascend to earth. Send your son to earth, and he will know how to bring us back, the humans." The following morning, the devil went up to earth. He set his sights on two young maidens, twin sisters, who believed very firmly in God. And ever so slowly, he crept up to them, flattered them, then began to follow them down the street. So much so that the young girls took fright and went to see their priest, Blaise, Father Blaise. And Father Blaise could sense a diabolical plot was forming around the two girls. So he said to them, "Beware, girls, every night before you go to bed, lock your bedroom door, and above all, be sure to light a candle in the window. It will stop the darkness advancing. The light will repel the darkness." And this is what the two sisters did day after day, week after week, month after month. Then one night, the devil possessed them. He saw to it that the two girls argued. The first sister ran sobbing into her room, slammed the door and collapsed in a heap on her bed. But still she remembered to light a candle in the window. The second sister ran weeping into her room, locked the door, but forgot to light a candle. And this was the night the devil stole into the house. He went up to the first door, turned the doorknob, and entered the room. The girl was sound asleep in bed. He went up to her, but turning his head, saw the candle burning in the window. The light burned his eyes. He closed the door and tried the handle of the second room. It was locked. So he summoned one of his demons, the incubus Accipides, demon of the air and frontiers, who could go through closed doors. The demon turned into a puff of black sulfur. Then the thick plumes of smoke floated through the keyhole, filling the room on the other side, and then no one really knows what happened next. All I can tell you is, the following morning, when the young girl woke up, her hair was all disheveled. She screamed and shouted to anyone willing to listen, "I had a terrible nightmare last night, and I'm pregnant by this nightmare." It isn't possible to be pregnant by a nightmare. It simply isn't possible. And yet, as the day went on, the poor girl saw her belly grow rounder, 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 and that very evening she gave birth to an abominable monster with hair from head to toe, claws at the end of its fingers, and hooves for feet. As soon as the monster came out of its mother's belly, Father Blaise came into the room, grabbed the devil's son by the scruff of the neck, and handed it to its mother. She looked at the infant and began to sob. When the first tear fell on its forehead, the monster changed. Its hair suddenly fell out, its hooves disappeared, and its forked tail vanished. And that was the day the devil's son, who was supposed to come to Earth to do absolute evil, turned from a monster into a charming little boy, who everyone around the world now knows as the greatest wizard ever, Merlin the Magician. Merlin is the son of the devil. He has all the devil's powers. He knows what was, what is, and what will be. But Merlin decides to use all these powers solely to do good.
Tolkien was familiar with Merlin, a key character in medieval lore. And yet the wizard's origins are even older still and are to be found in pagan Celtic mythology. In the Middle Ages, Merlin lived in the forest of Broceliande. The forest is now home to Comper Castle on the shores of a peaceful lake. But beneath its tranquil waters, the lake conceals the most beautiful legend about Merlin, his love for the fairy Vivian.
It's quite breathtaking.
Yes, it's wonderful. Would you like to hear the story of this lake?
Yes.
The story begins in this castle here. A fairy was born there. And the night of her birth, 3 fairy godmothers came to peer into her cradle. The first fairy gave her beauty, the second gave her intelligence, and the third gave her love. The most extraordinary love ever. But in exchange for all this, since you get nothing for free here in this world, in exchange she would be a prisoner for life in the forest of Broceliande. And so the fairy Vivian grew up in this forest. As for Merlin, well, one day he was walking through the forest when he met the fairy, and they fell in love with one another. He came back to see her at least once a year in Broceliande. So he visited her at least once a year, and Vivian wanted to know all of Merlin's magic. She didn't stop learning spells, magic formulas, and Merlin gave her his knowledge. And that's how Merlin came to be in the forest of Broceliande. One day, Vivian asked Merlin the magician to build her a place just for her. She was tired of living in the old red stone castle with her father. Merlin worked all night casting spells, and at first light, when the first birds sang, when Vivian opened her bedroom shutters, she saw another castle just below. But this castle was built entirely of the purest crystal. She was delighted. She kissed Merlin and thanked him. She moved into this castle, and Merlin went off to advise the kings of the world and do what he had to do around this wide, wide world. And the following year, he came back, and when he returned, Vivian was far less happy this time. She went to see Merlin and said, "Look, Merlin, a crystal palace is certainly beautiful, but it's transparent and everyone can see what I'm doing inside. Can't you do something to conceal it from the humans' prying eyes?" Merlin had a good think. He spent all night casting spells, and the following morning, Vivian opened her bedroom shutters, and below the red stone castle, she saw what we can still see today, a lake. And that is how Merlin concealed from humans' eyes the crystal palace he had built for Vivian. And that is how, from that day forward, Vivian earned a very pretty nickname. She became known as the Lady of the Lake. Now, people come here from all over the world.
The love story of Vivian and Merlin in Broceliande has been famous since the Middle Ages. The place they met still exists today, the legendary Fountain of Barrington.
Well, here we are, John, in the middle of the forest, at the source of the stories, at the source of the legends. The Fountain of Barrington. The fountain makes bubbles even though its water is as cold as stone. According to legend, this is where Merlin and Vivian met. It's a fountain already found in the first writings of the Middle Ages, in the 12th century. It was said that in the forest of Broceliande, of which the Bretons often fabulate, in other words, at the time, the Bretons were always telling stories about this little fountain. Back then, it was said fairies could be seen around this little fountain, and that's how the legend started. And symbolically, this fountain kind of became an allegory of the source, a source of inspiration, that is. May I have a look at your sketch, John?
Of course.
It reminds me of someone.
Really? Who are you thinking of?
Gandalf, Merlin.
Yes, I don't know yet. I'll be able to tell you when I'm done. I really don't know yet.
A mysterious magician, Gandalf, is one of the main characters of Tolkien's novels. How similar is he to Merlin?
So is it Merlin or Gandalf?
I often ask myself that question. I must admit that they have as many things in common as they have differences, in fact. And I can't reduce one to the other or vice versa. I spend far more time thinking about the origins of the image of the two.
Yes, it's true.
When you mention them, everyone has an image, but where this image comes from which period. What I mean is, how did the image gradually evolve?
You can find it already in the illuminations of the Middle Ages, this image of Merlin.
With the long white beard.
With the long white beard, the hair, and the long cloak too. Except that in the Middle Ages, this was only one of Merlin's appearances. It wasn't yet dominant. It was Gustave Doré in the 19th century.
Yes, the 19th, yes.
Then Walt Disney who imposed it. There's also this reference to the god Odin, who in Norse mythology is characterized in a similar way.
Yes, he has the wide hat, the cloak, and the staff.
That's right, yes. And Gandalf takes this reference too, I think. Gandalf is not completely Merlin. In the roles they each have in The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and then in The Legend of King Arthur and The Knights of the Round Table, and The Legend of the Holy Grail, they are fairly similar because it is they, in a sense, who pull the strings. And also, we know they're both working for good, but there's a whole dimension that escapes us.
Yes.
They also have a slightly malicious side, too. And then they disappear, and we don't always know where they are. Here we're talking about the links between Merlin and Gandalf. And they're obvious, numerous for sure. Gandalf, though, is J.R.R. Tolkien's invention. It's maybe the last avatar of the character that I mentioned, but his originality definitely stems from the freedom of Tolkien, this extraordinarily creative author who produced this incredible work, which is, in fact, the great epic of the 20th century, these epic fantasy novels.
Absolutely. Clearly. But tell me, the thing is, there aren't many hobbits in Merlin's world.
You haven't heard everything yet. You'll see. Come on, let's go and get warm.
So, where were you then?
Well, we got rained on. Welcome to Brittany. It was very beautiful.
In Brittany?
I thought for a moment we'd identified the well-known character Gandalf as Merlin, but it turned out to be far more complex than that.
I'm not surprised. Tolkien's world is always rather complex.
Yes, it's always less simple than it appears. It was very, very complex.
And the two of them, Merlin and Gandalf, have missions. They are sent to do something in the world. In both characters, we find something of the archetype of the mage.
Yes.
Of the sage, of the man who is not a common mortal. In fact, they both have a human appearance, but I don't think either of them is really human. One is the son of the devil, and the other is an angelic being. That is Gandalf's role. He's an angel incarnate, who comes to help free peoples defend their freedom against the Lord of the Rings, against the evil Dark Lord. For Tolkien, free will is fundamental because it is part of salvation, so it is part of his view of the world too.
So in fact, Tolkien's forte is to take these archetypes and add something personal and modern.
That's typical of Tolkien because he bases his characters on several sources at once. It is never simply the reproduction of a single medieval source or of a single character. He always creates them in his own way and takes the elements that interest him.
You could almost say Gandalf is a modern-day Merlin.
That's exactly what he is. And our friends, the hobbits, in all of this, did you find them there?
Well, no, actually, and I think I'll have to go back. There is still a whole chunk of the legend that remains to be told. I really enjoy strolling in the forest. You walk around, your eyes wander, and the stroll even involves your sense of touch. You have this contact with something solid which is beyond us. It's rough, it catches the light just as it catches you. I think you touch something that you should never forget. After all, we are a part of all this. To ignore that is to cut ourselves off from something wonderful. Tolkien, who had felt through literature and personal experience very strong bonds with nature, bitterly resented the advance of urbanization, the expansion of cities, the raising of woodland. And this resentment was expressed through a desire to be able to defend the forest. Merlin and Gandalf are in fact beings of this world, this boundless place which you enter at the risk of losing your way. Not only do you get physically lost, but you also lose your way in the domain of fantasy and fear.
John, now I'm going to tell you the story of Merlin the magician's first prophecy. This is the first written text found which mentions Merlin. It dates from 800 AD. Once upon a time, in the land of Britain, lived a very evil king. His name was King Vortigern. He was a king of the Britons, but a traitor, as he had become the ally of the Angles and the Saxons, the barbarian invaders who were attacking the shores of the island of Britain at the time, raping the women and mistreating the children. As he didn't really trust his new allies, this King Vortigern decided to build himself a big, impregnable tower. He chose the most beautiful hill, which was in the middle of Britain, and then began to build his stronghold. A whole week, night and day. But at the end of the first week, when the sun set behind the hill, a strange rumbling could be heard coming from the bowels of the earth. The hill began to shake and all the tower's stones came tumbling down. The builders were put back to work, but the second week, the tower collapsed again, and again the third week. The king went to consult his druids, and the druids told him if he wanted the tower to stay standing, then he had to mix the tower's mortar with blood, the blood of a fatherless 7-year-old boy. So the king sent his knights out across the kingdom, and those who went westwards came to a small village. In the middle of the village square stood a boy waiting for them with his arms folded. When the knights were within earshot, he said to them, "It's me you're looking for. My name's Merlin. I'm 7 years old and I have no father. Take me with you." Merlin came before King Vortigern and said, "Listen, evil King Vortigern, I shall tell you why your tower keeps collapsing. The tower collapses because it is built on a hill, and this hill is no ordinary hill. It is the sacred hill of Britain because beneath it lies a lake, and in this lake there are 2 slumbering dragons. And all the stones you place on the hill weigh on the 2 dragons' backs, and this disturbs them in their sleep. In the early morning, a hole was bored in the hill. What the child had said was true, except a ray of sunlight shone under the hill too, and this woke the 2 dragons from their slumber. They stretched their wings, destroyed the hill, and flew up into the sky. The 2 dragons fought for 3 days and 3 nights. There was so much blood and smoke in the sky that the light of the sun could no longer be seen. After these 3 days and 3 nights, the red dragon slew the white dragon. The ash settled, and Merlin appeared before the evil King Vortigern. He said, "You see, I was right. But that is not all. The white dragon lying dead at your feet is you. And the red dragon you saw fly off and disappear over the horizon is a man who will soon come to the land of Britain, a man called Uther Pendragon. And just as the red dragon killed the white dragon, Uther shall come and kill you." And just as Merlin had predicted, this was his first prophecy, Uther Pendragon came, killed King Vortigern, and took his place. And to thank the fatherless 7-year-old child who predicted his coming, he named him chief advisor of the kings of Britain. He became advisor to Uther Pendragon, and more importantly, to his son, the famous King Arthur. But that, John, is another story.
So far, as the hobbits are very discreet beings who can make themselves invisible, we haven't really found any trace of them. However, we had a very interesting encounter with Merlin the magician, who was advisor to the kings, notably to Uther Pendragon, King of Britain, who was the father of the famous King Arthur.
What is it? A hobbit?
I don't know yet exactly, but I don't really think so. Maybe closer to King Arthur. I may have to go and take a closer look.
In that case, you will have to go to his birthplace on the island of Britain, to Cornwall to be precise. Tradition has it that the future King Arthur was born in Tintagel.
In Tintagel? Off I go then.